The katana rested quietly in its wooden stand near the entrance of the Shinjuku dojo, its long, polished blade catching the soft overhead lights. 3 feet of carefully folded steel, passed down through 6 generations of the same family. It was not a practice sword. It had seen real combat more than 100 years earlier. Tonight that same blade would be pulled free in front of 30 silent students, and one of the most unusual challenges in modern martial arts history would begin. It was the evening of March 8th, 1971. The dojo belonged to Master Teishi Yamamoto, a 7th Dan karate instructor whose training hall still followed the old ways. No medals, no competitions for show, only serious practice. Master Yamamoto had invited a young Chinese-American martial artist named Bruce Lee to demonstrate his methods, Wing Chun and the newly developing art he called Jeet Kune Do. Many of the advanced students were curious. Some were skeptical. One person in the back of the room was already angry. Her name was Miyamoto Kiko. At 28 years old, she held 5th Dan rankings in both Kendo and Iaido. She came from a samurai bloodline that had once served the Tokugawa shogunate. Her great-great-grandfather had carried that same family katana during the Boshin War of 1868. Kiko had trained with the sword almost every day since she was 7. 6 hours of practice was normal for her. She believed traditional Japanese weapons arts were the purest form of combat and viewed the growing popularity of foreign systems with deep distrust. She had not been invited as a regular student. She had come for one reason only, to confront the man everyone was talking about. Bruce Lee finished his demonstration of wooden dummy techniques and pad work. Sweat shone on his bare shoulders. The students applauded politely. Master Yamamoto invited questions. Before anyone else could speak, Kiko stepped forward. Her voice was clear, formal, and sharp. "Mr. Lee," she said, "I have watched your demonstration carefully. I'm not impressed. Techniques against cooperative partners and wooden equipment mean very little. Traditional martial arts were created for real fighting against armed enemies. Your methods look clever, but they would fail against a true blade." Bruce listened without interruption. When she finished, he answered in simple, careful Japanese, with Master Yamamoto helping when needed. "I understand your view. Many modern styles have lost their connection to real combat. But good technique should work whether the opponent holds a weapon or not. Timing, distance, and understanding how the body moves, those things do not change." Kiko's eyes narrowed. "Principles are only words. Reality is steel." She pointed toward the sword stand. "That is my family katana. It is sharp and ready for cutting practice. If you truly believe your methods work, face me while I hold it. Defeat me, and I will accept that your art has value. Fail, and you should stop teaching students techniques that could get them killed." A heavy silence fell over the dojo. Every student understood what she was asking. An unarmed man against a live blade. Master Yamamoto stood up at once, ready to refuse and ask Kiko to leave. The idea was dangerous and against every rule of the dojo. Bruce raised one hand gently. "I accept," he said, "but under clear conditions. The sword must be real and sharp. You must attack with full intent, the same way you would against a real enemy. We will set a time limit of 3 minutes. If I cannot disarm you or force you to stop within that time, I will admit your point. If I succeed, you will admit that effective skill goes beyond style or weapons. Do you agree?" Kiko gave one sharp nod. "Agreed. But understand this, Mr. Lee. I have trained with this sword since childhood. I have cut through rolled tatami and bamboo targets. My family art is one of the oldest classical styles in Japan. You are making a serious mistake." She walked to the sword stand, lifted the katana with both hands, and slowly drew the blade. The steel sang softly as it left the scabbard. The wavy temper line along the edge glowed under the lights. Several students gasped. This was no wooden training weapon. This was a true shinken, a live sword. Master Yamamoto pulled Bruce aside, his voice low and urgent. "Lee-san, this is extremely dangerous. Miyamoto-san is a real expert. That blade can take a limb with almost no effort. Even a small cut could be serious. Please reconsider." Bruce placed a calm hand on the older man's shoulder and smiled. "I understand the danger, Sensei, and I respect your worry. But this is exactly the kind of test that shows whether martial arts are practical or only theory. I have trained for situations like this. It is an opportunity." The students quickly moved to the sides of the room, sitting in neat rows to clear the center floor. Kiko performed a short respectful bow to her sword, then took her place at one end of the training area. Bruce removed his shoes according to dojo etiquette and walked barefoot to the opposite side. He rolled his shoulders once, took 3 slow breaths, and settled into a relaxed, ready stance, weight balanced, hands open and soft at chest height. Master Yamamoto stood between them as referee. Though his face showed he wished the match would never start, he looked at both fighters, received a quiet nod from each, and spoke the traditional command, Hajime. Begin. Kiko moved first. Her steps were smooth and controlled. The point of the katana rose and settled in a classic middle guard, aimed straight at Bruce's eyes. The position threatened both vision and body at the same time. Bruce began to circle slowly at the edge of striking range, watching every small shift in her weight, every tiny change in how she held the handle. The air in the dojo felt thick. 30 pairs of eyes followed every movement. No one spoke, no one moved. The only sound was the soft slide of bare feet on polished wood and the faint whisper of steel as Kiko adjusted her grip. What happened in the next few minutes would be talked about quietly for years. Some would call it impossible, others would call it the purest demonstration of principle over tradition. But in that moment, none of them knew yet. They only knew that a sharp blade and empty hands were about to meet in the center of a Tokyo dojo, and the outcome would leave every witness changed. The first attack was already on its way. Kiko did not waste a second. The moment Master Yamamoto's voice finished the command, she closed the distance with smooth, practiced steps. Her katana stayed in the classic middle guard, the tip pointed directly at Bruce's eyes. It was a position that threatened both his vision and his body at the same time. Every student in the room recognized the stance. It was pure classical form, the kind that had been refined over centuries of real combat. Bruce moved sideways, staying just outside the perfect striking range. His bare feet made almost no sound on the polished wooden floor. His hands stayed open and relaxed at chest height, fingers slightly curved. He was not looking at the blade. He was watching Kiko's shoulders, her hips, the small shifts of weight that always came a fraction of a second before a cut. Then she struck. The first attack was a clean, downward cut, aimed straight at the top of Bruce's head. The blade dropped in a perfect arc, the same motion that could split a thick roll of straw mats in one stroke. It was fast, faster than most of the watching students expected from a woman of her size. The steel whistled through the air. Bruce moved his head exactly 4 inches to the left. At the same moment he stepped forward instead of backward. The blade sliced through empty space where his skull had been a heartbeat earlier. By moving in, he stepped inside the sword's effective length. The long blade that should have been an advantage suddenly became awkward and slow to recover. His right hand snapped out in a short, sharp slap that struck the outside of Kiko's forward wrist. The impact was not hard, but it was perfectly timed. It pushed the blade farther offline and broke the clean line of her recovery. At the same moment, his left hand closed around her right elbow, controlling the joint and stopping her from turning the sword back toward him. The whole exchange lasted less than 2 seconds. Kiko's training took over instantly. She spun her body in a sharp body shift, the kind of movement designed to break grips and create space again. She pulled free, but the brief contact had already given Bruce important information. How strong she was, how she balanced, and how quickly she reacted under pressure. They separated and returned to neutral distance. Kiko's breathing was still steady, but her eyes had changed. She had expected the first cut to end the match. It had not even touched him. She attacked again, this time with a straight thrust, aimed at the center of Bruce's chest. A thrust is faster and harder to see coming than a big cut. Bruce's hands moved almost before the blade started forward. One hand rose in a soft deflecting motion, while the other guided the tip just enough to the side so it passed harmlessly past his ribs. Again he stepped in rather than away. Kiko was ready for that. As soon as he closed, she turned the failed thrust into a horizontal slash that cut across the space where his body should have been. The blade travelled with enough force to break ribs if it landed. What happened next left the front row of students staring with open mouths. Bruce dropped his entire body 6 inches by simply bending his knees and sinking his weight. The razor edge of the katana passed over his shoulder so closely that several students later swore they saw individual hairs on his head move in the wind of the blade. At the exact moment her weight was fully committed to the cut, Bruce's right leg swept under her front foot. The timing was perfect. Her base collapsed for a split second. Kiko stumbled but refused to fall. She spun on her back foot, kept both hands locked on the handle, and faced him again. Her breathing was heavier now. Frustration showed for the first time in her eyes. 2 cuts that should have ended the fight had missed by inches. The man in front of her still looked calm, almost relaxed, as if the sharp steel flying past his body was nothing more than a training exercise. 90 seconds had already passed. The students along the walls sat frozen. No one whispered. No one shifted position. Master Yamamoto's hand hovered near his chest, ready to stop the match the moment blood appeared. But so far there was none. Kiko reset her stance. This time she was more careful. She began to use smaller movements, testing Bruce's reactions with short feints. She raised the tip as if starting a high cut, then dropped the blade suddenly toward his extended arm, aiming to slice the tendons and take away his ability to defend. Bruce did not fall for the fake. When the real cut came low, his fingers shot forward in a sharp thrusting motion and struck the back of her hands at precise pressure points. The impact was short but deep. For a fraction of a second, her grip strength failed. The heavy katana wavered. That single moment of weakness was all he needed. Bruce's other hand closed around her right wrist. He turned his hips and used her own forward force against her. Suddenly, Kiko felt herself being pulled off balance. She had two choices: let go of the family sword or fall forward. Pride would not allow her to release the blade. She fell. Bruce controlled the fall completely. He guided her down so she landed face first on the wooden floor, his body positioned behind her, both hands still controlling her sword arm. A joint lock settled into place. Pain shot through her wrist. Her fingers opened against her will. The katana slipped free and clattered onto the polished boards, the sound shockingly loud in the silent dojo. Bruce released the lock at once, stepped back 2 full paces, and bowed deeply. The entire exchange had lasted 2 minutes and 45 seconds. 15 seconds, under the agreed time limit. Master Yamamoto stood frozen, his mouth slightly open. The students exploded into confused voices. Some were shocked, some were excited. All of them were trying to understand how an unarmed man had taken a live blade away from a 5th Dan swordmaster without receiving a single cut. Kiko stayed on the floor for several long seconds, staring at her empty hand and the sword lying 2 feet away. The family blade that had never left her control in 21 years of training now rested on the dojo floor, captured by empty hands. Bruce walked over, picked up the katana with both hands the proper way, and carried it back to her. He presented it formally, the sharp edge facing himself as a sign of respect and peace. The match was over, but the real impact was only beginning. Kiko slowly pushed herself up from the wooden floor. Her right wrist still throbbed from the joint lock, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the storm inside her mind. 21 years of daily training, hundreds of matches won, a family blade that had never been taken from her hands, and now it lay on the floor because an unarmed man had simply decided it was time for the fight to end. Bruce stood a respectful distance away, still holding the katana with both hands in the traditional manner. The sharp edge faced his own body. There was no triumph on his face, no smile of victory, only calm respect. He stepped forward and offered the sword back to her. "Miyamoto-san," he said quietly, "you are an exceptional swordsman. Your technique is clean. Your cuts were real. You kept our agreement and attacked with full intent. I did not defeat your art. I only use principles that work against any attack, armed or unarmed, timing, positioning, understanding how the body works under pressure. Your traditional training has great value and should be protected, but every martial art, old or new, must be tested against real resistance if it wants to stay alive." Kiko took the sword with both hands. For a long moment she simply looked at the blade, as if seeing it for the first time, then she carefully slid it back into its scabbard. The soft click of the sword settling into place sounded final in the quiet dojo. She lowered herself into a formal seated position and performed a deep bow, forehead nearly touching the floor. When she raised her head again, her voice was steady, but much softer than before. "I have trained with this sword since I was a child. I have defeated more than 200 opponents in formal matches. No one has ever taken this blade from me. You did not use tricks. You did not use luck. You understood something most unarmed fighters never learn, that a sword is only dangerous at certain distances and angles, and that controlling the hand that holds the weapon is more important than running from the weapon itself." She paused, breathing once. "I was wrong to challenge you with arrogance. I was wrong to believe that traditional methods are automatically superior simply because they are old." The 30 students sitting along the walls remained completely silent. Even Master Yamamoto had not moved. What they had just witnessed was not a normal demonstration. It was a quiet rewriting of assumptions many of them had carried for years. Bruce returned the bow at the same depth, then stood and helped Kiko to her feet. There was no handshake in the Western style, only the mutual respect of two people who had tested each other under real conditions and survived with honesty. Master Yamamoto finally found his voice. He stepped into the center of the floor and spoke carefully. What we have seen today must stay inside this dojo for now. The Japanese Sword Federation will not be pleased if word spreads that a live blade was used in a challenge against an unarmed man. They will worry that others may try the same thing and get hurt. I ask every student here to keep the details private. Most of the students nodded. A few looked disappointed. They already knew. They had just watched something rare. But secrets in a dojo rarely stay secret for long. Several students wrote private notes that night. Those notes would later become the quiet foundation of the story that slowly travelled through martial arts circles in Japan and beyond. For Kiko, the real change began the moment she left the dojo that evening. She walked the Tokyo streets with the family katana on her hip, but her mind was no longer the same. Every technique she had practiced for years now carried a new question. Would this still work if the opponent refused to play by the old rules? Would this still work against someone who understood distance the way Bruce Lee understood it? She did not sleep well that night. The next morning she returned to Master Yamamoto's dojo earlier than usual. Bruce was already gone. He had a flight back to Hong Kong the following day. But the memory of the match remained in the empty training hall like a second presence. Kiko asked Master Yamamoto for permission to stay and train. Not only with the sword, she wanted to learn the soft, sticky hands of Wing Chun. She wanted to understand the intercepting ideas of Jeet Kune Do. She wanted to test her classical cuts against people who would not freeze when the blade came close. Master Yamamoto studied her for a long time. Then he nodded once. "If you are serious," he said, "you will train both ways. You will not abandon your family art. You will make it stronger by facing what it cannot yet explain." Kiko bowed. Over the following weeks she began a dual path that few classical sword practitioners had ever chosen. Mornings belonged to the katana, the same endless cuts, the same precise footwork, the same respect for the steel that had defined her life. Afternoons belonged to the unfamiliar. She stood in front of wooden dummies. She practiced sticky hands with senior students. She learned to feel force instead of only meeting it with force. At first the new training felt awkward. Her body wanted to reach for the handle of a sword that was not there. Her mind kept calculating distance in terms of blade length instead of arm length. But slowly the two worlds began to speak to each other. She discovered that the timing she had developed with the sword made her Wing Chun faster. The soft sensitivity of sticky hands made her sword work more adaptive. The rigid lines of classical form began to breathe. 3 months after the match, Kiko wrote her first letter to Bruce Lee. It was short and formal. She thanked him for the lesson. She told him she had begun cross-training. She asked if he had any advice for a swordsman who no longer wanted to live inside only one tradition. Bruce's reply arrived weeks later from Hong Kong. It was equally short. "Keep testing, keep asking. The day you stop questioning your own method is the day it begins to die." Kiko folded the letter carefully and placed it inside the wooden box that held her family's sword papers. The dojo students who had witnessed the match continued to train with a different energy. Some became more serious, some became more open to other styles. A few quietly began asking Master Yamamoto if they too could learn a little of the soft Chinese methods they had seen that night. The Japanese Sword Federation did send a formal letter to Master Yamamoto. They requested that no photographs or detailed written records of the event be shared publicly. They feared the story would encourage dangerous challenges. Master Yamamoto agreed to keep official silence, but the truth had already taken root in the people who were there. And for Miyamoto Kiko, the most important truth was simple. The sword was still her teacher, but it was no longer her only teacher. Word of what happened inside Master Yamamoto's dojo did not explode across Japan overnight. It moved the way real martial arts stories often move, quietly, from person to person, in late-night conversations after training, in careful letters between instructors who trusted each other. Some versions grew exaggerated, others stayed close to the truth. But the core facts remained the same. On March 8, 1971, an unarmed man named Bruce Lee had faced a live katana held by a fifth dan swordmaster and walked away without a scratch. The match had lasted 2 minutes and 45 seconds. The sword had ended up on the floor. For Miyamoto Kiko, the real battle started after the dojo lights were turned off. She returned to her regular training schedule the very next morning, but nothing felt the same. When she lifted the family katana, the steel still felt familiar in her hands. The balance was the same. The weight was the same. Yet every cut she made now carried a silent question. What if the opponent did not step back the way classical forms expected? What if the opponent stepped in? What if the opponent understood the exact moment when a long blade becomes a disadvantage? Those questions refused to leave her alone. She began changing the way she practiced. Instead of only cutting stationary targets, she asked senior kendo students to attack her with full speed while she used only her empty hands. At first they refused. The idea of swinging a wooden sword at a high-ranking Aikido master with no weapon felt disrespectful and dangerous. But Kiko insisted. She needed to feel the pressure again. She needed to rediscover the timing that Bruce Lee had used against her. The first few sessions were humbling. She was hit more times than she cared to count. The wooden sword tapped her shoulders, her wrists, her ribs. Each light strike reminded her how narrow the margin had been in the real match. Slowly, though, her body began to remember the lessons of that night. She learned to close distance at the exact moment the blade committed. She learned to control the weapon hand instead of chasing the weapon. She learned that sometimes the safest place was the place that looked most dangerous, inside the arc of the cut. At the same time, she continued her Wing Chun and Jeet Kune Do training at Master Yamamoto's dojo. The soft, sticky sensitivity of Chi Sao felt completely foreign at first. Her hands wanted to be hard and decisive. The new training demanded they become soft and listening. For weeks her wrists ached from the unfamiliar movements, yet something unexpected began to happen. The sensitivity she developed in sticky hands started to appear in her sword work. She could feel an opponent's intention a fraction of a second earlier. Her counters became quieter and more efficient. 6 months after the match, Kiko did something no one in her family line had done for generations. She invited instructors from other styles, karate, aikido, even a young student of Western boxing, to train with her. She did not ask them to become students of the sword. She asked them to attack her with whatever methods they trusted. Some days she used the katana. Other days she used only her empty hands. The goal was always the same: find the places where her classical training was strong and honestly face the places where it was incomplete. Not everyone approved. A few senior members of the traditional sword community heard about her experiments and expressed quiet disapproval. They felt she was watering down a pure art. One older instructor even suggested she was dishonoring the memory of her ancestors by mixing foreign methods with the family tradition. Kiko listened politely and continued training the way she believed was necessary. She wrote a second letter to Bruce Lee. This time it was longer. She described the changes in her practice. She asked hard questions about distance, timing, and the difference between technique that looks beautiful and technique that survives pressure. Bruce's reply came from Hong Kong several weeks later. He wrote only a few lines, but each one carried weight. Do not look for a perfect style. Look for what works when someone is truly trying to stop you. Keep the parts of your tradition that survive that test. Let the rest evolve or fall away. The sword is a tool. The mind that uses it must stay alive. Kiko read the letter many times. Then she placed it in the same wooden box that held the first one, next to the old family documents that recorded the history of the katana. By the end of the first year, something remarkable had taken place inside her. The arrogance that had brought her to Master Yamamoto's dojo that night was gone. In its place was a quieter confidence, the confidence of someone who had been defeated in the most public way possible and had chosen to learn instead of defend her pride. She began teaching differently as well. When new students came to learn the sword, she no longer spoke only of tradition and lineage. She spoke of testing. She told them the story of the night an unarmed man had taken her blade, not as a shameful memory, but as the most important lesson of her life. Some students were shocked. Others were inspired. A few left because they wanted only the pure classical path. The ones who stayed trained with a sharper focus than before. Master Yamamoto watched her transformation with quiet approval. One evening after training, he told her, "You lost a match that night, but you may have saved your art from becoming a museum piece. That is a greater victory." Kiko did not answer immediately. She looked down at the katana resting across her knees. The same blade that had been carried through war and peace for 6 generations now felt different in her hands. It was still a weapon of the past, but it was also becoming a bridge to something wider, 2 minutes and 45 seconds. That was all the time it had taken for her entire understanding of combat to crack open, and once it was open, she refused to close it again. 3 years after the night in Shinjuku, Miyamoto Kiko stood once again in the center of Master Yamamoto's dojo, the same polished wooden floor, the same soft overhead lights, the same soft overhead lights, the same family katana resting in its stand near the entrance. But almost everything else had changed. The students sitting along the walls were no longer only traditional karate practitioners. Among them were kendo players, aikido students, and even a few people who trained in the soft Chinese methods Kiko herself now practiced every week. The atmosphere felt different, less rigid, more curious. People came to this dojo not only to protect an old way, but to test whether that old way could still breathe in a modern world. Kiko had become one of the quiet leaders of that change. She never claimed to have invented anything new. She never stood on stages and declared that classical sword arts were incomplete. Instead, she simply trained openly and honestly and let the results speak. When she demonstrated, she sometimes used the katana. Other times, she used only her empty hands. Often, she asked students to attack her with whatever tools they trusted most. The lesson was always the same: respect the past, but do not become its prisoner. The story of the 1971 match had never been published in any official magazine. The Japanese Sword Federation's request for silence had been mostly respected. Yet, among serious martial artists, the account lived on in private conversations. Instructors who had been there as young students now told their own students about the night an unarmed man disarmed a 5th Dan swordmaster in under 3 minutes. They told it not as a tale of humiliation, but as a reminder that even the sharpest tradition must continue to prove itself. Kiko herself spoke of the match only when asked directly. When she did, her words were calm and without bitterness. I walked into that dojo certain that my steel was superior to any empty-hand method, she would say. I left understanding that steel is only as effective as the mind that directs it. Bruce Lee did not defeat Japanese swordsmanship. He showed me the places where my own understanding had stopped growing. That was a greater gift than any victory. She continued writing. Over the years, she published careful articles in small martial arts journals about the value of cross-training. She never attacked classical systems. She simply argued that any art which refuses to meet other methods under honest pressure slowly becomes performance instead of protection. Some traditionalists still disagreed with her. Others quietly began opening their own training halls to outside influences. Change moved slowly, the way it often does in arts that carry centuries of history. Bruce Lee returned to Hong Kong the day after the match and almost never spoke of it in public. To him, it had been a private test of principle, not a performance for fame. When asked years later by close students about facing weapons, he would only smile and say that the weapon is never the real problem. The mind behind the weapon is. Then he would change the subject. He died in 1973, only 2 years after that night in Tokyo. Kiko learned of his passing while standing in her family dojo, the katana in her hands. She performed a long, silent bow toward the south, the direction of Hong Kong, and then continued her evening practice. The blade felt heavier that night. In the decades that followed, Kiko became known as one of the rare classical sword teachers who actively encouraged her students to experience other systems. She sent promising young swordsmen to study Wing Chun for a season. She invited boxing coaches to teach her advanced students about timing and footwork. She never abandoned the precise forms of her family art. She simply refused to let those forms become a cage. Near the end of her teaching career, a young student once asked her the question she had been waiting years to answer. "Sensei, if you could face Bruce Lee again with everything you know now, what would happen?" Kiko looked at the family katana resting across her knees, the same blade that had been taken from her on a March evening in 1971, the same blade she had carried every day since. She smiled, the quiet smile of someone who had made peace with both victory and defeat. "I would still lose," she said, "but I would lose in a more interesting way. And that is the entire point. The moment you believe you can no longer lose is the moment your art begins to die." The student did not fully understand. Kiko did not explain further. Some lessons can only be lived. Today, the Shinjuku dojo still stands, though Master Yamamoto has long since passed. On the wall near the entrance hangs a simple framed photograph taken the evening after the famous match. It shows Bruce Lee and Miyamoto Kiko standing side by side, both in formal posture, the family katana resting on a stand between them. Neither is smiling for the camera, both look calm, almost thoughtful. Visitors who know the story sometimes stop and stare at the image for a long time. They see a Chinese-American martial artist who believed principles mattered more than style. They see a Japanese swordmaster who had the courage to lose in public and then spend the rest of her life learning from that loss. They see a moment when tradition and innovation met under a live blade and both walked away stronger. 2 minutes and 45 seconds. That was all the time it took to change one woman's understanding of combat, to plant a quiet seed in a traditional dojo, and to remind a generation of martial artists that the sharpest sword in the world is still only as dangerous as the mind that holds it. And somewhere in that short span of time, between the first cut that missed and the final lock that made the blade fall, a simple truth became clear to everyone who was watching. Real martial arts are not about protecting the past. They are about staying alive in the present. The katana still gleams under the dojo lights when the evening training begins. Students still bow to it with respect. But now they also bow to the empty space in the center of the floor, the place where, one night in 1971, steel met open hands, and both learned something neither could have learned alone. The story did not end when the sword hit the wooden floor. That was only the beginning.